Section 23 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Catherine Howard, Chapter 2, Part 2. On the 13th of November, Catherine was removed as a degraded prisoner from Hampton Court to Sion. Her disgrace was proclaimed to her attendants, who were assembled in the Star Chamber for that purpose, and the household was discharged. Though many of the Queen's ladies were, as we have seen, of the highest rank, the Lord Chancellor entered into all the details in his declaration of Catherine's former misconduct with Durham. He concluded with an intimation that there was a still further appearance of abomination in the Queen, which for the present he left in a cloud. The very next day Henry's ministers, who were in great haste to proclaim the dishonour of their royal master to foreign nations, addressed a circular announcing the whole order and story of the Queen's misconduct to the king's ministers abroad. They even obliged the French ambassador with particulars which ought never to have been made public, even if true. Francis I, in return, sent his condolences to Henry on the misbehaviour of Catherine Howard, saying, he was sorry to hear of the great displeasures, troubles, and inquietations which his good brother had recently had by the naughty demeanour of her lately reputed for queen. The motives of Henry's council in thus blazoning the charges against the queen as facts, before they had been substantiated as such by a trial, are glaringly apparent. There was a strong yearning in the king's heart towards her, therefore the chance existed of her regaining her former influence, since no actual evidence could be brought of her disloyalty to him, and, in the event of a reconciliation, those who had accused Catherine would have cause to apprehend punishment for conspiring against her life and fame. They played their perilous game with too much skill to allow the bruised reed to rise again, and before the first transport of Henry's indignation had subsided sufficiently to admit of his forming a dispassionate judgment of the nature of his wrong. For to be wrought with what we love doth work like madness on the brain. They struck a master stroke of policy by inducing him to sanction the publication of details which would prevent the possibility of his ever receiving Catherine again as his queen. In the meantime, information was conveyed to the council that the Duchess of Norfolk, on hearing the rumour of the arrest of the queen and Durham, had secretly dispatched a confidential servant named Pewson to Hampton Court to ascertain the real state of the case. Pewson on his return told his lady that it was reported that the queen had misconducted herself with Durham, and that Catherine Tilney was privy to her guilt. The Duchess said she could not think it was true, but if it were, all three deserved to be hanged. She then said to Durham's friend Damport, I hear Mr. Durham is taken, and also the queen. What is the matter? Some words belike spoken by him to the gentleman usher, was the reply. The Duchess expressed great alarm lest anything should befall the queen in consequence of evil reports. She gave Damport £10, doubtless to purchase his silence, and it seems she had been accustomed to allow him an annual stipend. The Duke of Norfolk was dispatched, by order of the king, to make search at the Duchess's house at Lambeth for Durham's papers and effects. Before his arrival, however, the old Duchess, with the assistance of the yeomen of her kitchen, and some others of her menage, had broken open the coffers and trunks belonging to Durham, and carried off, and, as it is supposed, destroyed, everything that was likely to be brought in evidence against herself or any of the parties implicated in the knowledge of the queen's early transgressions. When the duke reported what had been done by his stepmother, she and all her servants were placed under arrest, and very strictly examined by the council. The following is the account given of the examination of one of the delinquents. First we began with Ashby, the Duchess of Norfolk's man, and wrote on Sunday 3 or 4 leaves of paper, where, among many long tales of small importance, he said that when the Duchess broke up Durham's coffers, he, Ashby, and her comptroller, a priest, were present, besides the smith, who picked the one coffer and broke open the other. The Duchess took out all the writings and carried them to her chamber, saying she would peruse them at her leisure, without suffering any person to be present. The like she did also with such writings as were in his mail. She declared she meant not any of these things to come to revelation. She would have had Ashby take a satin coat belonging to Derham in the place of 30s. 8d, which Derham owed him, but he refused it. He confessed also that the duchess had been in the greatest fear lest Alice Wilkes should have told Lord William of the familiarity between the queen and Derham. She would have sent one to Calais to have informed the Lord William Howard of this matter if she had not been advised to the contrary. He, Ashby, confessed that she, the duchess, once said, that if there be no offence since the marriage, she, the queen, ought not to die for what was done before, and also that she demanded whether the pardon would not serve other persons who knew of their naughty life before the marriage. Also he confessed that she broke open a chest and 2 coffers of Damport's, after he was committed to the Tower, and likewise took out all his writings and letters at this breaking also. Ashby and her comptroller were present, and one Dunn, yeoman of her cellar, who played the smith's part. On a second and third examination of the persons concerned in this transaction, nothing further could be learned than that the duchess found several bundles of papers, some ballads, and books with musical notes for playing on the lute, among Derham's effects. How his trunks and personal property came to be in the Duchess of Norfolk's house can only be accounted for on the supposition that his office at court did not entitle him to lodgings in the palace, that he was only there in rotation with other gentlemen in waiting, and that his general home was in the house of his noble kinswoman, the Duchess of Norfolk. Who his parents were is unknown, yet he always had the command of money, as we find by his costly presents to Katherine when she was living as a dependent in the house of the duchess. Derham, on being cross-questioned on Catherine Tilney's evidence, touching the Duchess of Norfolk's knowledge of his clandestine courtship of the queen when a girl, admitted the fact, that the duchess had once seen him kiss her granddaughter, for which she struck him and beat her, and gave Bulmer a blow for permitting it, as related before. Many times also, he said, she would blame him and Katherine. He said, that he was introduced into the royal household by the queen's desire, who told the Duchess of Norfolk to bring him. How far this was fact cannot be ascertained, but all the evidences agree that he was introduced into the palace by the Duchess of Norfolk. Lady Howard deposed that being in the court the queen once asked her where Derham was, and she replied, "He is here with my lord," and the queen said, "My lady of Norfolk hath desired me to be good unto him." Be this how it might, the circumstance of his being in the household had the worst possible effect on the queen's cause. Moreover, it was the only available fact against her, and was used by the council as presumptive evidence that it was her intention to wrong the king. Henry naturally regarded it in that light. Mr. Secretary Wriothesley gives a lively account of the terror of the Duchess of Norfolk and her resistance to the royal mandate, when he brought the order for her arrest. The recent butchery of the aged Countess of Salisbury of course rendered such a proceeding sufficiently alarming. The Duchess immediately fell very ill, and said she was not well enough to be removed, on which Wriothesley tells the council that he and the Earl of Southampton and Mr. Pollard went to see her, the better to perceive whether she were indeed as sick as she pretended. "At first," says he, "we entered as though we had only come to visit and comfort her, whereby we perceived in short space that she was not so sick as she made for, but able enough to repair to my lord chancellor as his highness appointed. Then began we to tell her that my lord chancellor had certain questions to demand of her, which should much serve to the clearing of the matter, and so advised her to repair to him, saying the matters were not long, ne such as we thought she would not both shortly and truly answer. But here she began to be very sick again, even at the heart, as she said, which was the sickness of mistrust, that if she went she would not return again. Nevertheless, with much ado we got her to condescend to her going, and so we departed, to the intent that she should mistrust no false measure, and we all stayed at the house of me, Sir Thomas Wriothesley, till we saw her barge pass. We have also travelled this day with Pewson, whom we have in custody, but he is yet stiff. Marry, he confesseth already his going to Hampton Court after Derham's apprehension, but the purport of his going to those parts was to buy boards for my lady of Norfolk, and faggots for himself at Kingston, as he saith, but we think he can, and shall tell another tale, wherein, as all the rest, we shall travail to the best of our powers to get out the truth. Sir, we pray you to send hither all examinations as you have touching these matters, that we may peruse them, and pick all such things out of them as may serve to the purpose of our business." Katherine had now the bitter agony of learning that her aged relative was not only involved in her disgrace, but was sick and in prison, and in peril of being brought to a death of ignominy for having concealed her light conduct. "We twain," write Southampton and Wriothesley, "went to the Tower, and then first began with my lady of Norfolk, whom we found on her bed as it appeared very sickly. Pressing her as much as we might to declare some further matter and knowledge touching the misconduct of the queen and Derham, assuring her on his majesty's behalf of her own life, if she would in some sort make us her ghostly confessors, she made us answer, that she would take her death of it, that she never suspected any wrong between them. She took God to witness, that she never thought them to be of that abominable sort she now knoweth them to be of. Nevertheless, she will not deny that she perceived a sort of light love and favour between them more than between indifferent persons, and had heard that Derham would sundry times give her (Katharine Howard) money, which she thought proceeded from the affection that groweth of kindred, the same Derham being her kinsman. But in that she told not his majesty thereof before his marriage, and in that she brake Derham and Damport's coffers, she confesseth to have offended God and his majesty, and beseecheth his majesty most humbly therefore, in his most noble heart to forgive her, and to be her good and gracious lord as he hath been, for otherwise her days would not be long. We assure you she appeareth wondrous sorrowful, repentant, and sickly." Queen Katharine and her grandmother were both at this period sick nearly unto death with grief and terror, and in their separate prisons they were assailed with subtle interrogatories day after day by the pitiless members of King Henry's council, of which the purport was to outrage all the ties of nature by rendering them witnesses against each other. Some of the questions put to the unhappy queen bore no reference to her alleged offences, but are standing proofs of the insolent curiosity of those by whom she was examined. She was even asked what change of apparel the duchess was wont to give her yearly when under her care, with other questions of the most irrelevant and trivial nature. No evidence proving the crime of adultery against the queen could be extorted from the Duchess of Norfolk or any other witness. On the 31st of November, Culpeper and Derham were arraigned for high treason in Guildhall before the Lord Mayor, contrary to any previous form of law. Justice was out of the question, for on the right hand of the intimidated civic magistrate sat the Lord Chancellor, on his left the Duke of Suffolk. The Lord Privy Seal, the Earls of Sussex and Hertford, with others of the council, also sat as judges that day. By those great state officers of the crown, some of whom had previously presided while the prisoners were questioned by torture, Derham and Culpeper were adjudged guilty and condemned to the dreadful death decreed to traitors. But though this sentence was pronounced, no proof of the crime of which they were accused had been established, and as it was considered necessary to substantiate the charge against the queen, they were respited for a few days, not in mercy, but that they might be subjected to fresh examinations by torture. They bore the extremity of their sufferings from day to day, if not unshrinkingly, without permitting anything that could criminate the queen to be wrung from the weakness of exhausted nature. Culpeper maintained the innocence of his royal kinswoman to the last unswervingly, nor could the extremity of torture draw from Derham an admission that the slightest criminality had passed between himself and Katharine since her marriage with the king. Damport, his friend, was subject to the torture of having his teeth forced out in the brakes, an instrument supposed to be the same as that called the Duke of Exeter's daughter. Worn out with his sufferings, Damport at length desired to speak to one of the council, and he would make confession. The report of the two gentlemen to whom his admissions were made is as follows. I, Sir John Gage, and I, Sir Richard Rich, went to him, and his saying for that time was, that Derham once said to him, when the king favoured Mistress Katharine, I could be sure of Mistress Katharine Howard, and if I would, but I dare not, the king beginneth to love her, but an he were dead, I might marry her. Damport also confesseth that Derham told him, that the Duchess of Norfolk once said to a gentlewoman in the queen's chamber, pointing to him, This is he who fled away to Ireland for the queen's sake. Damport confesseth this now, but would not do it before, for any torture that he could be put to. We have resolved, that both he and Derham should be seriously examined again this day of certain points. Derham maketh humble suit for the remission of some part of the extremity of his judgment, wherein we require you to know his majesty's pleasure. He denied these confessions of Damport. From Christ's Church, this Tuesday morning, December 6th. The council, by the king's direction, gave this reply to the query of the coadjutors of London. Touching Culpeper and Derham, if your lordships do think that ye have got as much out of Derham as can be had, that ye shall then, giving them some time that they may prepare themselves to God for the salvation of their souls, proceed to their execution. At Oatland, this present feast of the Conception of Our Lady. We think, writes Wriothesley again, we can get no more out of Derham than is already confessed. Therefore, unless we shall hear otherwise from the king's majesty, we have resolved that they shall suffer tomorrow, December 9th. This was followed by an order from the council in London to the council with the king, saying, though they thought the offence of Culpeper very heinous, they had given orders for him to be drawn to Tyburn, and there only to lose his head, according to his majesty's most gracious determination. Derham petitioned for some mitigation of his cruel sentence, but, when application was made to the king, the following was the reply. The king's majesty thinketh he deserveth no mercy at his hand, and therefore hath determined that he shall undergo the whole execution. On the following day Derham and Culpeper were drawn to Tyburn. Culpeper, out of consideration of his noble connections, was beheaded. Derham was hanged and quartered, with the usual barbarous circumstances of a traitor's death. Both protested their innocence of the crime for which they suffered. The heads of both were placed on London Bridge. Wriothesley expresses an enthusiastic wish that everyone's faults, who were accused, might be totted on their own heads, and thus proceeds to sum up the malfactions of the Duchess of Norfolk in the following order. First, having knowledge of Catherine's dereliction, she did recommend her to his majesty, and afterwards was a Mahon medium for her to extend favour, or rather to renew favour to Derham. And when Derham was taken and in the Tower for his treason, after the same was declared to her by the whole council, she did secretly break up 2 chests, and out of the same conveyed all such letters as might manifest her own knowledge of the affair. There is something peculiarly characteristic of the man in the zest with which Wriothesley enters into the proceedings against the unfortunate kindred of the queen. Yesterday, he writes, we committed the Lord William Howard, his wife, and Anne Howard. The Lord William stood as stiff as his mother, and made himself most clear from all mistrust or suspicion. I did not much like his fashion. This letter is in confidence to his colleague, and affords shrewd signs of a conspiracy in the council against the queen and her family. Why else should Wriothesley have disliked the appearance of fearless innocence in Lord William Howard, or felt uneasy at the probability of his clearing himself from the charge that was aimed at his life? As for his property, that was immediately sequestered, and strict inquiry made into the truth of a report, that some of his lordship's stuff, or goods, had been thrown into the sea during the stormy passage of Lord William and his family from France. The loss was, however, confined to the mules and horses. The unfairness with which the trials of Lord William Howard and Damport were conducted was so great that the master of the rolls, the attorney and solicitor general, and 3 of the king's council, the very persons who had taken the examinations, were brought as witnesses against the prisoners, in lieu of other evidence. The offence of Damport was simply that of being acquainted with the previous state of affairs between his friend Derham and the queen before her marriage, which, instead of revealing to the king, he had tattled to his acquaintance. He was in the end subjected to the most horrible tortures to make him declare more than he knew. Had he known more, it would have been divulged, for he had not the faculty of keeping a secret. The council were greatly embarrassed what to do with the infant children of Lord William Howard, 4 in number, and those of Lady Bridgewater, who were thus rendered homeless, but at last they consigned them to the custody of Cranmer, of the Bishop of Durham, and of Lady Oxford, to be dealt with according to their own discretion and convenience. The members of the council in London, in one of their letters to the council with the king, express a fear, as the Duchess of Norfolk is old and testy, that she may die out of perversity, to defraud the king's highness of the confiscation of her goods. Therefore it will be most advisable that she, and all the other parties named in a former letter, may be indicted forthwith of misprision of treason, whereby the parliament should have better grounds to confiscate their goods than if any of them chanced to die before the bill of attainder passed. Here then was a laudable attention to the contingencies of life and death for the benefit of the royal purse. Shades of Dudley and Epsom, hide your diminished heads, while the dealings of the council of the monarch, who brought ye to the scaffold for deeds of wrong and robbery, are unveiled. In a letter dated December 11th, his majesty's council is advertised, by the council in London, that they have found the value of 2,000 marks in money, and about 600 or 700 in plate, belonging to the Duchess of Norfolk. The disgusting thirst for plunder, which is so marked a feature in the proceedings of the king and his council at this period, was further gratified on the 21st, when Southampton, Wriothesley, and Sadler triumphantly wrote to Henry to inform him that they had had another interview with the poor sick old duchess, who had voluntarily confessed where she had hid 800 pounds in money of her own property. On the news of this unexpected addition to their prey, they informed the aged captive that it was the king's gracious intention to spare her life. Whereupon she fell on her knees with uplifted hands, and went into such paroxysms of hysterical weeping that these gentlemen were sorely troubled to raise her up again. Henry certainly appears to have derived much consolation for his matrimonial mortifications from the rich spoils of plate, jewels, and money, which were torn from the kindred of his unhappy queen. Sir John Gorstick and John Skinner were appointed to go to Reigate to Lord William Howard's house, to take an inventory of all the money, jewels, goods, and chattels they should find there, and bring the same to the council. Mr. Secretary Wriothesley, Master Pollard, and Mr. Attorney were appointed to go to the Duchess of Norfolk's and Lord William's houses at Lambeth for the same purpose. Sir Richard Long and Sir Thomas Pope were sent on the like errand to the Lady Bridgewater's houses in Kent and Southwark. The Duchess of Norfolk's house at Horsham had been previously ransacked. Lady Rochford's house at Blickling in Norfolk was also put under sequestration. Mary Lassells was, by the desire of the council with the king, exempted from the indictment for misprision of treason, in which all the parties privy to the queen's early frailty were included. So low had the personal dignity of the sovereign fallen, that a feeling of gratitude was expressed in his majesty's name to this woman, because she did from the first opening of the matter to her brother seem to be sorry, and to lament that the king's majesty had married the queen. Great credit is given by the council to Mary Lassells for her good service in having revealed the matter, and also that she had refused to enter into the service of the queen. Beyond her own assertion, there is not the slightest evidence that she ever had the offering of doing this, and it was probably Catherine's neglect or forgetfulness of this woman that provoked her to the denouncement. It is impossible to overlook her enmity to the queen throughout, so end the friendships of vice. Damport, Manox, and the Duchess of Norfolk's servants were found guilty of the crime of misprision of treason. They made pitiful supplication for mercy, and the punishment of death was remitted by the king. The new year opened dismally on the fallen queen, who was still confined to the 2 apartments hung with mean stuff that had been allotted to her in the desecrated abbey of Sion. Her reflections during the 2 dreary months she had worn away in this wintry prison may be imagined. They were months replete with every agony, shame, grief, remorse, and terrible suspense. On the 16th of January, 1542, the new parliament that was to decide the fate of the queen met at Westminster. Catherine had indeed received a promise that her life should be spared, but if, relying on the sacredness of that promise, she had fondly imagined the bitterness of death was past, she must have been more astounded when the bill for her attainder was brought into the House of Lords. She was without friends, counsellors, or money at this awful crisis. The only person who might have succoured her in her sore distress was her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, if he had been so disposed. This nobleman was one of the greatest men of the age. In point of naval, military, and diplomatic talents, he had no second. He was the premier peer of England, and his unbounded wealth enabled him to retain in his band of pensioners a little standing army of his own in defiance of all the royal edicts against feudal retainers. He had the power of rising up in the House of Lords and demanding that his niece, the Queen of England, should be allowed the privilege of an Englishwoman, a fair trial for the offences of which she had been accused by her enemies, and that, if guilty, she should be proved so by the law, and not treated as such on presumption only. But Katherine, probably, had offended her uncle by withdrawing herself from his political tutelage. Like her fair and reckless cousin, Anne Boleyn, she had spurned his trammels in the brief hour of her queenly pride, and when the day of her adversity arrived, he not only abandoned her to her fate, but ranged himself on the side of her enemies. We have seen how this duke treated Anne Boleyn at the time of her trial. His conduct to the unhappy Catherine, whom he had been partly the means of placing in a situation so full of peril, even to a woman of sound principles and approved conduct, appears scarcely less cruel and vindictive. It is impossible that feelings of personal apprehension could have elicited from the conqueror of Sir Andrew Barton and one of the victors of Flodden the expressions we find in the following extract of his letter to the king on the arrest of the members of his family who were involved in the disgrace of the queen. The Duke of Norfolk to Henry VIII. Most noble and gracious sovereign lord, yesterday came to my knowledge that mine ungracious mother-in-law, mine unhappy brother and his wife, with my lewd sister of Bridgewater, were committed to the Tower, which I, by long experience, knowing your accustomed equity and justice used to all your subjects, am sure is not done, but for some of their false and traitorous proceedings against your royal majesty, which revolving in my mind, with also the most abominable deeds done by 2 of my nieces against your highness, hath brought me into the greatest perplexity that ever poor wretch was in, fearing that your majesty, having so often and by so many of my kin been thus falsely and traitorously handled, might not only conceive a displeasure in your heart against me and all other of my kin, but also abhor in manner to hear speak of any of the same. Wherefore, most gracious sovereign lord, prostrate at your feet, most humbly I beseech your majesty to call to your remembrance that a great part of this matter has come to light by my declaration to your majesty, according to my bounded duty, of the words spoken to me by my mother-in-law, when your highness sent me to Lambeth to search Durham's coffers, without the which I think she had not further been examined, nor consequently her ungracious children, which my true proceedings towards your majesty being considered, and also the small love my 2 false traitorous nieces, and my mother-in-law, have borne unto me, doth put me in some hope, that your highness will not conceive any displeasure in your most gentle heart against me, that God knoweth did never think thought, which might be to your discontentation. This letter seems to throw some light on the hostility of the Duke of Norfolk to the unfortunate queens, his nieces. They had evidently espoused the cause of the old Duchess Agnes in the family feud, and her influence had probably been exerted both with Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard in crossing his political measures and lessening his credit at court. The bill for attainder of Catherine Howard, late Queen of England, Jane, Lady Rochford, Agnes Howard, Duchess of Norfolk, Anne, Countess of Bridgewater, Lord William Howard, Anne Howard, wife to the Queen's brother Henry, and some others, was read for the first time January 21st. On the 28th, the Lord Chancellor, feeling some misgivings as to the legality of bringing the Queen and so many noble ladies to the block without allowing the accused the opportunity of making the slightest defence, reminded the peers how much it concerned them all not to proceed too hastily with the bill for attainder of the Queen, and others, which had been yet only read once among them, bidding them remember that the Queen was no mean or private person, but a public and illustrious one. Therefore her cause ought to be judged in a manner that should leave no room for suspicion of some latent quarrel, and that she had not liberty to clear herself, if perchance by reason or counsel she was able to do it. For this purpose he proposed that a deputation, as well of the Commons as of the Lords, should go to the Queen, partly to tell her the cause of their coming, and partly, in order to help her womanish fears, to advise her to have the presence of mind sufficient to say anything to make her cause the better. He added that it was but just that a princess should be tried by equal laws with themselves, and expressed his assurance that it would be most acceptable to her most loving consort if the Queen could clear herself in this way, and in the meantime the bill against her was ordered to be suspended. This equitable proposition of the Lord Chancellor was disapproved and negatived by the Privy Council, by whom it was determined that no opportunity, however limited, should be granted to Katherine, of either speaking in her own defence or impugning the testimony of the witnesses, on whose unsifted assertions she was to be brought to the block. Whatever the conduct of the Queen had been, she was in this instance the victim of the most unconstitutional despotism, and the presumption may be reasonably drawn, from the illegality and unfairness of the proceedings of the Privy Council, that the evidence against her could not have been substantiated if investigated according to the common forms of justice. On the 30th of January the Lord Chancellor declared that the Council, disliking the message that was to be sent to the Queen, had thought of another way less objectionable, which was to petition the King that the Parliament might have leave to proceed to give judgment and finish the Queen's cause, that the event of that business might no longer be in doubt, that his Majesty would be pleased to pardon them, if by chance in speaking of the Queen they might offend against the statutes then in existence, that the attainder against Durham and Culpeper might be confirmed by the authority of Parliament, and that his Majesty would, out of regard to his own health, spare himself the pain of giving his assent in person to the bill of attainder, but allow it to pass by letters patent under his great seal. 7 days after, the 6th of February, the bill was, with brutal haste, hurried through both houses. On the 10th, the Queen was conveyed by water from her doleful prison at Sion to the Tower of London, under the charge of the Duke of Suffolk, the Lord Privy Seal, and the Lord Great Chamberlain. No record has been preserved of the manner in which Catherine Howard received the announcement that she must prepare for this ominous change. It is possible that, till that moment, the elastic spirits of youth, and a fond reliance on Cranmer's promise, had preserved the hope that keeps alive despair. Those by whom she was guarded and attended on her last cold desolate voyage had been silent as to her deportment, and no page in history tells us whether Catherine Howard behaved with the proud firmness of a descendant of the Plantagenets, or betrayed the passionate grief and terror of a trembling woman, when the portentous arch of the Traitor's Gate overshadowed her devoted head. With the length of the voyage and the season of the year, it is probable that darkness must have closed over the wintry waters of the Thames before the forlorn captive arrived at her destination, exhausted with fatigue and benumbed with cold. If this were the case, she was spared the horror of beholding the heads of her seducer, Durham, and her unfortunate cousin, Thomas Culpeper, over the bridge. One night of suspense was passed by Katherine in her new prison lodging before her fate was sealed. How that interval was spent is unrecorded. End of Section 23.